Hi, everybody. We can't see you out here, but glad to see you all. My name is B. Hanson. I'm the director of the New York State Office of Victim Services. And I know it's been a really, really full day, so really appreciate all of you staying for the final panel. We have an incredible group of people on the stage here who have dedicated really their lives and their work to ending gender-based violence and ending violence in general and really repairing harm in communities. So I want to introduce in the middle of the group here, Jennifer Hughes, who's a survivor and Safe Rising case manager, Saloni Sethi, who's the commissioner of the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, Bernadine Waller, next to me here, who's an assistant professor at Columbia University, Liz Roberts, who's the chief executive officer at Safe Horizon, and Kira Shepard, who's the vice president of Common Justice. So just give a round of applause just for all of them. So thank you for being here. So I know that this panel has really been talking about the reporting that's been done through Crossroads Research and some of the reporting that came out of the National Crime Victim Survey. And you know, one of the things that's been interesting to us from those of us that work in victim services is that we've really seen an increase in New York City of people accessing victim services. So for the first time, we're close to 30% of people who are victims of crime who are actually reaching out to services. Studies in the past are 7%, 17%. So, and New York City is really an outlier, 7 times more than other cities in terms of people accessing victim services over the last few years. So I wanted to start with Jenny and to really talk about you know, your experience as a survivor of domestic violence. When you think back to when you were accessing services, what were the services and supports that you received, and what do you think was the most helpful for you at that time?
Good afternoon, everyone. Great question. So the services that I did receive was services from the Office of Victim Services for moving and storage. I also received assistance with my Section 8 application and transfer because the incident happened in Manhattan and in the Bronx. And so at the time, when I went to the Brooklyn Community Program at Safe Horizon, I received assistance with the application for Section 8, moving and storage, and they were able to move me to Brooklyn, to a safer area.
Great, great. Yeah, so that the kind of practical resources, the housing resources
Yes.
are really, really critical. Saloni, why do you think that New York City is such a kind of an outlier in terms of our access to victim services and why people are reaching out?
Yeah, so I was looking at the data, and I think, you know, the increase in uptake of victim services is really from like 2012 onwards. I think it like decreased, then increased. And I was thinking about it, it's like what's happened since 2012 in the city, right? And one of the things is like the amount of investment that the city has made in victim services over that period is significant, and it's grown, right? So I think of like we opened our last Family Justice Center in 2015. CVAP, right, expanded and became a program, the Crime Victims Assistance Program.
Can you say what CVAP
Yeah.
stands for?
Thank you, B. No, and so CVAP is a Crime Victims Assistance Program, which puts victim advocates at every police precinct and PSA throughout the city, right? That's around the same timeline where that program really grew and became sort of at the scale that it needed to be. And I think, and similarly, you know, we have a program that invests in community-based, smaller grassroots organizations, started around the same time and has grown really over the past 10 years, right? So I think it's like that investment, and it's not only that we're investing in the same type of service, it's really a diverse types of services, right? We're really kind of thinking, where else can we reach folks? If they're not gonna walk into one of our family justice centers and seek services there, how can we meet them in the communities where they live? How can we meet them in the precincts where they're going for other reasons, right, after reporting an incident? And so I think that's really part of it. And then the other big piece I really have to say is like the good work of all of our community-based partners, right? Because what we know is that if it didn't work, people wouldn't come back. And we know that really is a part of it, is that people talk to their friends and their family members and, you know, suggest that all the time, right? Like this helped me, it might help you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, if you look at New York City, we have a lot more culturally specific and community-based programs than like any other city, and really diverse across the city. Liz, kind of from your perspective, Safe Horizon, large crime victim service organization, what's kind of your sense of why we've seen that uptick? I know, you operate CVAP, so that's, I think, part of it, but kind of get your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Saloni that the city has made really substantial investments over the last 15 years. And it wasn't all at once. It's kind of been a steady process of investments over the years. And that is a huge factor. I also think there's a cultural factor, which is that I believe those are years in which, as a society, we have become much more aware of trauma. And we particularly begun to talk about the trauma that men experience as a result of violence in their communities, in their lives, in their homes, more openly than we ever did before. And so I think there are a lot of different things going on here, but I also think there is a willingness to admit you might need some help, and also a receptivity on the part of victim service providers like Safe Horizon to a broader range of crime victims, and that's been really, really important. I have to brag for a minute about the Crime Victim Assistance Program, because the first thing I thought when I looked at these numbers is like, oh, we helped make that happen. So in 2017, we launched the Crime Victim Assistance Program. As Commissioner Sethi said, it places advocates in every single police precinct in the city. And there was this steady growth in the number of people that we saw each year. So in the first year, it was just 12,000 victims of violence. But in fiscal year 23, we saw 53,000 victims of violence just through that one program. And it's unique because it's proactive outreach at the time of a crisis that's come to the attention of the police. And so we're reaching a lot of people who would not have called the hotline, would not have asked for help at that moment. But because there's this proactive outreach, they're having a conversation with us about their safety, about how they're doing emotionally, about what they might need, and we're able to connect them to supports if they're interested in that. Over the last 8 years, we have served 375,000 people, and half of them were not victims of domestic violence. They were victims of other types of violence or crime. So I do think it's expanding New York City's victim services to a much broader range of victims. Somebody who got knocked down and their bike was stolen. Those kinds of everyday crimes that I think people don't realize sometimes how traumatic they are, or that there's concrete help like crime victims compensation available. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that the Office of Victim Services at the state level has also been steadily expanding their investments into our service sector.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, it's great to hear all of the things that we're doing in the city. I think, the flip side of this also is that, great, 30% of victims are, getting services, but that means 70% are not. So I want to turn to Bernadine, and you do a lot of research in the areas of barriers and in the Black community particularly. But so what's kind of up with the other 70%?
Thank you so much, B, for asking that question. I think what's up with the other 70% is that there are structural factors that we need to comprehensively take under consideration, such that if I hear that there's been a shooting of an unarmed Black man or a Black woman, that's going to impact my overall perception of the police. And so I may be more reticent to connect with providers who people of other ethnicities may feel more comfortable with connecting with. And then once I call them, what I'm also seeing is that there is a greater likelihood that women who are racialized as Black, regardless of their ethnicity, if they're racialized as Black, sometimes they are not seen or perceived as vulnerable as people who might be racialized as white. And so that disavowalment, right, the communities talk to one another, right, in the same way that Commissioner Sethi said, when it's working, the good news travels. When it's not working, that news travels as well. And so what that results in, and this is not just specific to New York City, although it is occurring in New York City, we're seeing Black women who are murdered at rates 3 times that of their white peers, right? And so during the pandemic alone, in one of our boroughs, our rates doubled in IPV homicides, specifically among Black women. And so why are they not leaving? They're not leaving because they don't feel safe to leave. And women have said to me, I would rather stay with the enemy that I know than have to suffer at the hands of the police or have to suffer in the shelter system. And so we've got wonderful resources, and I think we said this in panels earlier today. We've got great resources, but limited accountability of the people in those resources to make sure that the people who are the most marginalized and the people who have our resource restricted actually have full access and services and supports that women who are of other ethnicities and races have as well.
Thank you for that, Bernadine. Kira, just to add to that, kind of from your perspective at Common Justice, sort of what are you seeing in terms of that kind of 70% of people who aren't accessing services? What are the barriers and things we're seeing there?
Yeah, so at Common Justice, the work that we've done through our direct service work, we work with a lot of survivors of violence and victims. And over the years, we found, like as Bernadine or Bernadette has said, is that a lot of victims don't want to report their harm to the police. And the National Crime Victims Survey actually showed that from 1999 to 2022, the number of people who have actually reported their harm to the police has been steadily going down. More than half people who are victims of crime don't report their harm to the police. And actually, there's an increased perception that the police won't do anything. So that's why we work with legislators and victim service providers about like 3 years ago to create a bill called Fair Access to Victim Compensation that would basically decouple law enforcement from healing services, specifically the healing services people get from victim compensation funds. And victim compensation funds, for folks who don't know, are state and federal funds that go to crime victims after a crime happens, and it reimburses them for services that they paid for, such as mental health care, medical care, lost wages, crime scene cleanup, funeral costs. So these are really important services. So our bill basically got rid of the mandatory police reporting requirement so that people can actually go to victim service providers or medical providers instead of police. And we heard from like numerous and countless victims that we work with that they didn't want to go to the police for a number of reasons. And outside of the fact that a lot of people just think that the police won't do anything, some people are afraid of retaliation. If the person who harmed them finds out that they went to the police, they might be retaliated against. Some people are undocumented. I don't have to say more than that. Like, you don't want to interact with the police. Black and brown people mistrust the police because of police brutality and death that has come at the hands of officers. So the coupling of healing services with criminal justice agency and services and supports is really problematic for a number of survivors. And we're doing something to eliminate that. Thankfully, the bill passed. The effective date is December 2025. We've been working with the Office of Victim Services, which is now headed by B, and they're doing a great job to implement that particular legislation. But unfortunately, a lot of states around the nation still have the mandatory police reporting requirement.
Thank you for that, Kira. I want to just interject in my OVS role. I think, I think part of what I think we're seeing in the state too is just, and the city particularly, is better collaboration between government and service providers. I think you have people like me and Saloni who've come out of victim service providers, and I think that, I hope helps, to really be grounded in the kind of work that we need to do to make some of the changes. So, the change that Kira talked about in terms of fair access to victim compensation is allows people who are not able to report to police or don't want to report to the police to be able to do that And in that we're also trying to change our system so that like you can use your phone to file for compensation. It'll be much quicker. So all of those kinds of things. And in the budget this year, the governor added in, and this is based on what we hear advocates needing, like increased burial benefits. It's been like $6,000 for forever, and now it's going to be $12,000, and increased money for people who've been victims of financial scams, and that's really that kind of collaboration. So I just think that's important, and to have those conversations about how we how do we support survivors better. And government's always going to be slower than the advocates, but I think the connection is critical. I wanted to kind of focus on that. When you look at like 50% of victims are not reporting to the police. So what, Jenny, kind of in your role, both in terms of your experience as a survivor, but also in your role as a case manager, we've talked a little bit about that but from your case management perspective, why do you think so many survivors don't contact the police, and how do we support survivors in that situation?
Great question, B. Well, personally and professionally, I will say this. So I would say that there's underreporting because of fear of retaliation, delay in response, if there's a response at all. And also with the callers that call into the helpline. I speak with a lot of undocumented women, and they stay in the relationship due to financial dependency and lack of resources. So they feel that if they were to report DV to the police or any incidents to police, that they will get deported. So there's a mistrust. And so what we do is provide that safety planning and validate them to let them know, although these are your fears, it's important to speak up. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking to the police, we're here to support. And there's also, CVAP is great. There's a lot of callers that felt very safe speaking to a crime victims advocate, apart from speaking to the police. And so with me personally, I was afraid to speak to the police because they actually threatened me. So on Thanksgiving Day, 2006, a police officer, there was a violation of order of protection, and they picked me up to be able to identify my abuser. And the officer told me, it's Thanksgiving. Before we drove off, he told me, are you going to report this? Are you going to go through with this or not? Because it's a holiday, and we would all like to go home. I went through with it. But as I went to the police precinct, they had me behind a mirror to identify the person that called me home, and he was right there in front of me. And that experience was the experience that stopped me from calling the police, and I continued contacting Safe Horizons hotline for support.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That is, yeah. I mean, and that is going to, so it's amazing that you're a case manager now, kind of doing this work. But Saloni, it looked like you wanted to
well,
say
because
something to
it makes
respond.
me think, like hearing Jenny speak in all of it, right? Is that like ultimately we were talking about when somebody's experienced violence is that they've experienced trauma, right? And trauma is about like loss of control over your own safety, and the work with any trauma survivors to give them options and agency and control. And like that's just not something the system does well, right? Like no matter what. Whether it's criminal justice, whether it's shelters, Bernadine mentioned, right? It's like what people know is that going into those systems, you lose some control that the system takes from you, right? And I think like that's such a challenge, right? And I think even what you're saying be about like better collaborations, it's like that's why those collaborations are so important. It's because there's certain things in some ways the system's always going to be a little bit more one size fits all. It's always going to center itself more than the survivor, right? Even though there's been lots of good work done to make things better, right? And I think about like the issue of like criminalized survivors and resistive violence. There's been a lot of good work for the system to start recognizing those things, but it will never be able to give a survivor the agency they need to heal. Right. It's not what it's set up for in some basic way. And so I think that's where the partnerships and the community-based orgs and even like communities and, are so important.
Yeah, yeah. And Bernadine, do you want to talk a little bit of that, a little bit more on the on kind of that that?
How
piece
did
of
you
it?
know,
I
B?
can tell. I'm looking at. I'm like, forget the script. I'm looking at the body language.
I'm like, can we toss it? Yeah, I think if I were to have a crystal ball, the thing that I would love to see is, as we're talking about culturally specific services and care, specifically as it relates to Black women, right? What we do know is that Black women are the most religious segment in our society. On any given Sunday, 80% of Black women are in churches, they're in mosques, they're in their religious institution, and even Black women who are not religiously affiliated are spiritual. And so how are victim services making closer connections with our faith-based organizations, right? And so if I want to meet someone where they are, I need to come out of my place to meet them at their churches. What does that look like on a Sunday? Right? And then, and this is me talking as not only as someone who researches this, right? Someone whose life has also been impacted by intimate partner homicide, which is why I'm very focused on Black women, right? Because I've had 2 friends who've been murdered by their intimate partner, one of which happened during the pandemic. I'm also the leader of my domestic violence ministry at my church. And so what I do know is that women are coming to their churches, they're coming to their pastors, they're coming to people who are trusted pathways because our formal service provision system, holistically, no offense, right? We have inflicted harm because we're not providing them with the agency that they need in order to feel safe. And so I would challenge all of us, right, who are on the stage and all of us here who are in the audience to see what can we do to authentically meet people where they need to be met.
Thank you for that, Bernadine. Kira?
Punjab, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a that's a great suggestion. I mean, and you know, the work we do at Common Justice, so we have a direct service aspect of our work, and we also have policy and organizing teams. So our organizing team is often out in the communities across all the boroughs talking about victim compensation, and we mostly work in Black and brown communities. And usually, I would say 9 times out of 10, no one has even heard about the fund. And so I'm constantly thinking about, okay, what more can we be doing to let people, and I've talked to B about this, to like make sure that our communities know about this fund, because most of the people who are survivors and victims are Black and brown, mostly Black men, actually the large majority of them. So, you know, although there are advocates at police stations, which are great, oftentimes we hear from the survivors that we work with oftentimes a lot of mothers who've lost their children to gun violence. They say that they're criminalized, that their children are criminalized by police departments. They're not actually seen as survivors because oftentimes the police assume that somehow they had something to do with how they were harmed, that they were involved in a gang. So they might not even, so if that person goes into the police department, that mother might not even be connected to the advocate because the police are criminalizing them once they come inside the door, the police district. So I do think that we need other places and Black specific, culturally specific places that are providing the services and information about victim compensation.
Totally. Yeah, and I think that's some of the things that we're trying to do too, is like get the word out.
Yeah, yeah,
And just a
and I have
quick
to say,
plug.
you are doing a good job because we are working and having those conversations about like how to get the word out in Black and brown communities.
There is one nonprofit organization that provides technical assistance to churches. And the only one that I know in New York City is called Connect NYC.
Yeah.
Right? Connect NYC actually trains pastors and religious leaders throughout all the boroughs of New York City, right? And so I'm not saying we reinvent the wheel. Let's connect with the people who already have the connections and make sure they're funded and make sure they have the resources to give us access to these populations because they've built years of trust in the Black community. And so for any given training, you're going to get 15, 20 different pastors or religious leaders across the boroughs, across different denominations, and across different faiths to get the training. So I just wanted to put that in.
Thank you for that, Bernadine. I know, Liz, you want to add?
Yeah, I would love to jump in. I have so many things I want to say, so it's hard to know where to start. The first thing is just I think that I have the distinction, along with B, of having been in this field for a very long time. In my case, since the early 80s, so it's when domestic violence shelters were actually new. And I think over many years, we worked hard to build systems that could respond to the needs of survivors. And we made some progress. But as the commissioner said, those systems have become very, very bureaucratic. And it's something that we bump up against every day at Safe Horizon, because we try to run our programs in a really client-centered way. But there's this whole like raft of rules and regulations that make it very difficult to do that, and that make, the role of our staff to find client-centered solutions that really meet the needs of the person in front of us very, very difficult. But I think there's been a real underinvestment in what you were talking about, Dr. Waller, which is the focus on community response, the focus on people having trusted resources in their community that they can go to for help, and that our reliance on systems has in some ways given communities the message that this is not your problem. It's ACS's problem, it's the police department's problem, it's the court's problem, but actually it's all of our problem. And so, as Safe Horizon thinks about our future as an organization, we want to still be right there in the police precinct and in the courts for people who come to those systems for help, because we can make their journey easier and help them get more of what they need. But we really want to look at how communities can be more supported to respond to the needs of survivors in their community. And I think the example you gave is a beautiful example of that. And it's the direction we need to move in as a society. And I think there's a growing understanding of that, which is good news. At the same time, we need to get some of the bureaucratic barriers out of the way. And I've been thinking a lot about the role of emergency shelter. It's one of the few options for a domestic violence survivor who is in fear right now and has nowhere to go. And some of those folks will go to a family member, will get an order of protection and stay in their home, or will do other things. But there are times when really the very best option is to access an emergency shelter that is set up for people experiencing domestic violence. And we have a big challenge in New York City, which is that if you are an adult survivor, it doesn't matter how much danger you're in, and you don't have children with you, it's actually extremely difficult to get into a domestic violence shelter. And so every day at the hotline that we operate, we're turning people away who are in real danger, have real need, and there's spaces in the shelter system, but because they're not bringing children with them, they don't have the same access. Yeah. And I should just say there's a solution, which is a bill that we're promoting at the state level called the Safe Shelter Act that would actually really go a long way to help resolve that issue. We're hoping to get it signed this year, passed and signed.
Great. Where are we with time? I was told not to bring my watch, so oh, we have plenty of time. Okay, good. So I wanted to just think about if we could just do whatever we wanted to do. Where, no, but where do you think needs to be the next step? I think I think there's a few people here who could talk about more restorative practices. There's some push in the whole gender-based violence field and crime victim field to think about how do we do more restorative practices with people who are causing harm. And there's been some work in that area. But can somebody talk a little bit about that, and maybe just some sort of other kinds of what's next? Where would we want to go?
I'd love to speak to the restorative justice piece, because we're doing some work in that area with intimate partner violence at Safe Horizon. Of course, Common Justice has a lot more experience with that, but not specifically with intimate partner violence. So we've heard from survivors over many years that and not every survivor by any stretch, but for many survivors of domestic violence, they actually want us to help their partner as well as help them. And we've tended to have a response of no, they need to go get their own help. We're not going to even talk to that person. And I think that, that came out of a fear of making things worse. It was a legitimate fear, but I think it was short-sighted. And so we're now doing some work in Staten Island where we will work with the whole family. It's pretty serious domestic violence cases where there's been family court and child protective involvement. So there's been some real risk to kids or harm to kids. And we're finding that we can work with the whole family safely. We always keep victim and child safety at the center. We don't bring the whole family together right away. We sometimes never do, but the idea is to really figure out how can this family exist safely. And it may be that the two adults will never, sleep under the same roof again, but they're raising children together. And so they're going to have contact. And so how do we help them do that more safely? And how do we help it be safe as possible for the kids? And we've found that restorative practices and a willingness to approach the person who caused harm in a trauma-informed, respectful, supportive way really, really works. We've had amazing engagement. So we're one of many organizations that have been kind of dipping their toes into that kind of work and finding success in doing it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
And thanks for mentioning Common Justice. So yeah, at Common Justice, we've been around for over 15 years, and the direct service work is really based on restorative justice. So we work with individuals between the age of 16 and 26, mostly Black men who have committed a violent felony. We're one of the only organizations, restorative justice organizations in the nations that work with people who have committed a violent felony. And if they successfully complete our program, their violent felony is taken down to a violation. And they don't have to go to prison, which is great. But I think at the heart of our program is our work with victims. And we actually, when a victim has been harmed, they're the first people we actually go to. We work through the district attorney's office, and we go to the victim and we say, do you want the person that has caused harm to go through this program? And 90% of the victims we go to say yes. And I think it's because most of our victims, our survivors, are Black and brown as well, and they know how problematic and harmful the criminal justice system is. They don't want to see people go through that. And I think another problem with the criminal justice system as far as victims are concerned is that when you go through the criminal justice system as a survivor, you really don't have a lot of engagement with the person who's caused you harm. You can't really talk to them. You can't even find out why they caused you that particular harm, which I think causes a lot of problems and trauma in itself. So through our restorative justice program, we bring the person who caused harm together with the survivor eventually, right? There's a whole process. It's over a year-long process. But eventually we bring them together to have conversation about what happened, and the person who caused harm has to be held accountable. We call it a rigorous accountability, and agree to a set of community agreements that the survivor helped put together. So the survivor really has a say in what happens after they're harmed through our restorative justice process. So it's one of the reasons I came to Common Justice. I think it is the answer to the solution to a lot of the violence we see in our communities.
Thank you for that, Kara.
Yes,
Yes,
you can go ahead. Yeah, so I think, something sort of thinking about as we're talking about this, right, is that a lot of times the way the work has evolved, we try to help victims, ignores the realities of their lives and their lived experiences, right? And so I think about how we shift to really understanding that all forms of violence are connected, right? So your experience of interpersonal violence, whether it's gender-based, whether it's not gender-based, is not separate from your experience of violence in your community or violence in the world or violence in your history, right? And so I think that's such an important piece that we sort of miss, right? And I think about some of the work that we do with the RISE project that really works at the intersection of gun violence and intimate partner violence, right? And how so much of their work is really about changing those norms in community, right? And community education. Like, how do we start talking about healthy relationships and healthy norms, and like start like getting people to understand, because we've never given people those tools, right? We just haven't for the most part when it comes to like how do we navigate conflict and how do we navigate interpersonal relationships. Most people are raised just like watching their parents who, 50-50, right? Like depending, maybe worse sometimes. And so I think it's like a lot of that work. How do we get into community and really understand like what are the norms? What are the norms that are harmful? How do we shift those norms? I think is really, really important. And then on the restorative justice piece, one thing I'd sort of say is, we just had a restorative justice convening that B was at and Liz was at last week, which is really focused on restorative justice and intimate partner violence, right? And I think one thing that's like really important to remember is like a lot of the restorative justice work has evolved in kind of like relation to alternative to criminal justice systems, but there's a lot of work that exists outside of that as well that really is about restoring the survivor. And so one of our partner orgs, VIP, started a restorative justice program for survivors outside of criminal justice processes. And what they were saying is most of the survivors who come in, what they want restored is not the relationship with the person who caused harm, but like with their family members who like judged them, right? Or who they felt isolated from or whatever, or like the community members or their children. And so I think there's a lot there too in terms of creating more options for healing and really letting the survivor lead the way in what they want.
I think some of that is also how do we shift some of the systems around that, because our systems for funding are often like bean counters, like how many people did you touch, how many people did you do these things, and it's not really around change. And how do we think about that in a different way? Jenny, you want to add?
What I was thinking about is more community engagement, because you'd be surprised. There are callers, when I receive calls at the helpline, they don't know anything about the Office of Victim Services, what are the services that they provide. They don't know about Safe Horizon services, other organizations. I didn't know about Safe Horizon services or the Office of Victim Services when I was receiving assistance. So, and when I explained to the callers, well, this is how we can assist, or this is how they can assist, it's like, wow, all of this for me, like this is all of the services that are offered for a person like who has gone through crime, harm, and abuse. So it's a lot of awareness. A lot of people are not aware that there's help, that there are organizations that can assist.
Yeah.
So yeah, community engagement, outreach. Like when everybody was speaking, outreach was just in my head going, yeah.
Yeah. And how do we do that? And so,
Right.
do you want to talk a little bit about? You talk about faith, and then you have other ideas. I know.
The idea, okay, so little known secret about me is I used to be in media when I was in Philadelphia. So, my former TV mind comes into mind and radio. And what most people don't realize is most newspapers and radio stations will have free ad space for outreach and awareness. And so how often are we engaging in those mechanisms to connect with a television station or radio station or a newspaper to let them know, you know what, there's ad space, heaven forbid there was something, yeah, I'm not going to give the example I was about to give. But there are times when a newspaper will literally pull an ad if, say, for example, there was an ad for a major whatever in that industry, there was someone in that industry that had a quarter age ad. They now have space in that publication to be able to run free ads. And so how often do we even know that exists? That's number one. Nope. And then are we even connecting with our local newspapers and community radio stations and local radio stations to say, hey, here's what's going on. This would impact and benefit this community. Let's do this, right? And so that's thing number one, right? And I'll be quick, right? Because I just saw the sign. So thing number two, and I'm so glad, Commissioner Sethi, that you noted that, I would pour more money into primary prevention efforts,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We've got to catch, IPV doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There's community violence, right? And what we also need to understand, what are some of the underpinnings of community violence? We've talked about that earlier in our panels before, right? Think of resource restriction, think of poverty, think of education. How can we make sure that we are educating our children so that they understand what a healthy relationship looks like, right? A child who's been exposed to IPV, either male or female, is 3 times more likely to replicate that cycle in their own relationships. How do we stop those cycles? The other thing I would do is there is a movement right now in psychology and social work to decolonize practices. And what does that mean? Inviting people like Jenny to the table, right? And asking Jenny and elevating Jenny's voice. So I appreciate, B, how you have elevated Jenny throughout this entire panel to make sure that all the rest of us who are eager to say something, Jenny's voice doesn't get lost. Because oftentimes when we invite people like Jenny into these spaces, their voices get lost. We don't hear them, we don't value what they have to say, and we don't do what it is that they're recommending that we do, right?
Thank you, Bernadine.
Um,
Thank you.
so that's out.
We all know we could go on for a while, a long while. So I think we want to open it up for some Q&A. Is that right? So are there any questions or comments or challenges or thoughts?
Thank you, panelists. I was happy to see an all-women panel, and then I saw the section was about healing and care, and I was like, oh, okay. And so I'm trying to, maybe you guys can help me form this question or answer it however it comes up for you, but I'm wondering about that fact and how care and healing work is often relegated to women. And what kind of issues and challenges you guys face in your work, but then also what we as an audience can do about that to make healing and care work a community issue, not just a women's issue.
Okay. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I've got one sort of quick, concrete answer that comes right to mind because we talk about this a lot at Safe Horizon. Our workforce is 83% people of color and about 85% women, providing the kind of, frontline services that we're talking about to people in crisis. And the way that we're funded, it is very hard to pay a living wage to the folks who do that work. And it's something we've been working very hard at, is bringing our wages up. But we're in an environment where women's work and the work of women of color in particular is profoundly undervalued by our economy and by our funders. And that is one of the ways that we need to, really fight back, is challenging those assumptions and challenging those structures.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll jump in quickly. Yeah, we do a lot of work with the survivors of gun violence, and oftentimes, and we do a lot of work with survivor-led support groups, and all of the survivor-led support groups are women, mothers, aunts who've lost their children to gun violence, and then they go on and help other people in their community who have faced the same type of loss. And I've been in so many powerful groups of with survivor-led support groups, but mostly Black women, basically helping each other out. Lots of tears, very spiritual, beautiful, and oftentimes they're reaching into their own pockets to help somebody else, to pay for different costs, to pay for the Uber ride to the courthouse, to pay for someone to go to a media outlet to complain about the fact that they got the story wrong when they talked about their loved one's death, to pay for therapy. They help therapize each other. So I think that we know a lot of money go to, not enough actually, violence interrupter groups, but not enough money goes to these women who really need the support, and they're doing the type of preventive services that are really needed to help heal our communities, and they're not getting the support. They're not even getting recognized, and it's so sad to see. They do powerful work.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Yeah, other questions? It's hard to see. Let's see. Yeah, and I think in our field that working around this issue that like we also don't see private support, private philanthropic support, And I think some of it is just how hidden the issue of violence and victimization is. Although for those of us in this work, we're just, it's every day. But that whole kind of idea of like people don't know who to call. Like how do we think about partnering with whoever we need to partner with to really get the word out about resources and to bring people out of a sense of shame, because I think there's so much shame around violence and victimization as well.
Can I just add something? We sort of had this whole conversation as if we weren't in this moment of dramatic change and disruption to the work that we do. And I just want to name that I think we're in a time where there are like powerful cultural forces that are moving us in the wrong direction. We had somebody call our hotline the day after the presidential election in November, and she said, my partner, he knocked me to the ground. She's a woman living with a disability, and he left me there for a long time. And he said that he could do whatever he wanted because Trump had won the election. And we see a series of cabinet appointments of men who have documented histories of violence against women. And, I think we're hearing the attack on DEI is an attack on approaches that seek to eliminate racism in our systems and structures. It's also an attack on women's progress in our country. And so I think we're going to see a deepening of misogynistic norms and behaviors at the same time that we're going to see resources stripped away from the kind of life-saving essential services that our clients, all of our clients, rely on. And so if there were ever a time for communities to step up and think about what our community response is to these issues, how can we support each other, this is the time. And I think it's also a time for people with resources, with influence, to really stand firm that we're not going back.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Oh, there's another question? Oh.
Thank you all for all the amazing work you're doing and for sharing it with us today. Obviously, the populations that you all are serving require and deserve the most urgent and intensive version of these types of healing services and reparative work. But to your point, I think a lot of people need that. A lot of people need healing. A lot of people need restorative justice for the variety of things that they feel violated by or alienated from. I had the opportunity to go to a restorative justice event up at Sotomayor houses not that long ago that was just open to practitioners. I had never been to an event like that before. It was very affecting to me. I feel like I derived a lot of my own healing out of that without having a significant experience of violence to be healing from. But I do think that that kind of experience does lend a lot of legitimacy to the healing work that we're talking about, even for people who don't need it so severely, but can have a newfound experiential understanding of the importance of the work. So I'm interested in whether you all see versions of that in your own lives or in other people who you interact with, and whether there are existing resources or things that you would recommend that would open up some of these types of restorative practices to people who don't necessarily need them or know they need them, but would benefit a lot and could support the cause a lot better for that experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like a couple things, right? Like I think something that I was like, when we're talking about restorative justice work, I always want to be like, we're always really quick to be like, here's a new shiny thing, it's going to work. Let's take it and put it here, here, and here, right? But it's like, it's an actual shift in framework of how we think about justice, right? So it's an actual shift in perception of what we think justice is and who's in charge of deciding it and all of the above, right? That is focused on the person who is harmed. So I think like that's important. I think that's why a lot of times you need to sit in those spaces to experience it yourself to really understand it. And it's like an ongoing process, right? It's like, it's about the process, not the outcome necessarily, which is important. But the other thing is you're talking that I thought about is like, we had this convening. So our office had worked with partners in New York City in 2018 to do like a blueprint of restorative justice in cases of intimate partner violence. Because while it was being used other places, it wasn't really being used in intimate partner violence. And that blueprint kind of looked at practices that were happening and made recommendations for how to grow the work. And then that led to funding from a foundation to do a collaborative to keep doing that work for 5 years. That funding ended. So last week they did a whole look back of what have we learned in the collaborative, right? And so it's something I thought was really interesting, which is relevant to your point. It's like that they decided they were working with people nationally. They're doing restorative justice in the case of intimate partner violence. And they wanted to bring practitioners together to do like case conferencing type work on cases that were challenging to support each other. And they realized that they didn't really even talk about the cases at all, but all they needed was a space for each other to be in circle with each other, right? And kind of just talk about some of the stuff that's like coming up for them. And so that's the direction that they went in, which is, I think, really interesting and kind of beautiful in terms of like, yeah, we're all healing from something. We're all traumatized by something. And like this work brings it up. And so being able to meet that need, even if that wasn't the intention, I think is a really important part of the work.
And I think that also raised like the whole sense of community. And I think, as Liz talked about before, that we are, we're getting thrown a lot of stuff at us from the federal government. And, and I think for those of us working in state and city government, seeing that and all the nonprofits of like, how do we preserve the great work that we've been doing in Black and brown communities and in queer communities and immigrant communities, and how do we preserve that when we're seeing national backlashes against that work. And those are exactly the people that are in most need of the support that we're all providing. So how do we maintain that work? And so that means us being together as community, and how do we, and I think that this moment has really created more of a sense of community. I've seen some of these people on this panel that I've known for a long time. I've seen a lot more of them in the last like couple of months than I've seen in the last few years. So, I think that community piece is really critical. Do we have time for another question, or are we, I don't know where we're at with our timekeeper people. We're wrapping? Okay. So thank you all for being here. I want to just thank all of the members of this panel, and thank you for all of your support and for staying here and being here with all of us. And we will continue the conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.